Yeah, it's me again. Okay, if you made it through that big, long video PowerPoint on permit required confined spaces, you're probably confused. And that's to be expected. It's a lot there. There's a heck of a lot there. And I always think some of these OSHA standards could be written a little bit more concise and not back and forth so much. And anyhow, but if you had to put in a permit required confined space program, even if I had to do it, and I've done it before, I'd have to go back to the standard and just go do it, start from scratch. I mean, there's so much in it, you'd have to do that. So don't be surprised if you don't know everything there's to know about the permit required confined space program, but you kind of have an idea so you know where to go. And you do need to know the three things that make up a confined space, and the four things, one of which can make up a permit required confined space. That you need to know. That will come up. You will use that. Trust me. All right, we're going to go into that the confined space flow chart here, decision flow chart. All right, I like flow charts. So this isn't too bad. And I'm going to go through this decision flow chart. It's in Appendix A of the standard. And the decision-making process is, does the job fall under the standard? Can hazards in the space be eliminated? You verify acceptable entry conditions, monitor throughout entry, abort if there's problems, audit program when you're finished. And that's it right there. Now that looks, it still looks a little daunting, doesn't it? All right, we're going to look at each one of these. And we're going to look at these, where they refer to which part of the standard they refer to when they refer to a standard. So each one of these is going to pop up here. Appendix A, 1910.146, permit required confined space decision flow chart. Well, that kind of is here. Okay, decision flow chart. So appendices A through F are non-mandatory. So there's a whole bunch of these appendices, which is the plural appendix, and A through F are all non-mandatory. It means you don't have to do them, but they're there to help you. That's how confusing this is. I got 1, C, D, E, F, 6 of them to try to help you out. All right. This is A. So we're going to start off at the top. You can see it's highlighted red on behind it and then bigger on red so you can read it better here. So does the workplace contain confined spaces as defined by 1910.146? That's the very first question. Are there any there? So confined space means it's large enough and so configured that an employee can bodily enter and perform assigned work, has limited or restricted means of entry or exit, is not designed for continuous employee occupancy. That's a confined space. Now, remember the question here, which is confined spaces, not permit required confined spaces. So now, next question, does the workplace contain permit required confined spaces as defined by 1910.146B? So a permit required confined space or a permit space means a confined space that has one or more of these characteristics: contains or has the potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere, contains a material that has the potential for engulfing an entrant, has an internal configuration such that an entrant could be trapped or asphyxiated by inwardly converging walls, or by a floor which slopes downward and tapers to a smaller cross section, or contains any other recognized serious safety or health hazard. So that's the next question. And if the answer is no, then you consult other OSHA standards and stop it. In other words, this says going through this checklist if there are no permit required confined spaces. And there very well might not be. I mean, that's very possible. But now if the answer is yes, okay, yes, now you do have permit required confined spaces. So you need to inform the employees as required by 1910.146C2. That's what's in this flowchart, and I pulled up in blue what that says. If the workplace contains permit spaces, the employer shall inform exposed employees by posting danger signs or by any other equally effective means of the existence and location of and the danger posed by the permit spaces. Note, a sign reading danger, permit required confined space, do not enter, or other similar language would satisfy the requirements for a sign. So now you've determined there's confined spaces, permit required confined spaces, but now you got to let people know, posting signs or any of them. You got to let them know you have them and they're dangerous, okay? Now, the next question is, will permit spaces be entered? And if the answer is no, this prevent employee entry as required by 1910.146C3 do task outside of the space. And what does 1910.463 say? If the employer decides that its employees will not enter permanent spaces, the employer shall take effective measures to prevent its employees from entering permanent spaces and shall comply with paragraph C1, C2, C6, and C8 of this section. C1 says the employer shall evaluate the workplace to determine if any spaces are permanent required confined spaces. Note, proper application of decision flowchart in Appendix A would facilitate compliance with this requirement. So it's basically coming back to itself there on that. So, and then C2, if the workplace contains permanent spaces, the employer shall inform exposed employees by posting danger signs or by any other equally effective means of the existence and location of and the danger posed by the permanent spaces. And there's that same notice about sign. And C, when there are changes in the use or configuration of a non-permanent confined space that might increase the hazards to entrance, the employer shall reevaluate that space and, if necessary, reclassify it as a permit required confined space. So when you have these confined spaces that aren't permit required, you want to be careful because they can very easily become permit required. So now that question they asked, will permit space be entered? What they really meant was by your employees or the company employees of the site that they're on, because now they come up and say, well, contractors enter. So, okay. So then you go over here to, if the contractor will enter, yes, task will be done by contractor's employees. Inform contractor as required by 1910-146, and the contractor obtains information required by these, by C8 and C9 from the host. And now here's what these are. C8, I'm going to have to look out of this for a second. In addition to complying with the permanent space requirements that apply to all employers, each contractor who is retained to perform permanent space entry operations shall, I can get that back, now back to full screen, obtain any available information regarding permanent space hazards and entry operations from the host employer, coordinate entry operations with the host employer, with both host employer personnel and contractor personnel will be working in or near permit spaces as required by D11 of this section, and inform the host employer of the permit space program that the contractor will follow and of any hazards confronted or created in permit spaces, either through a debriefing or during the entry operation. Okay, now will both contractors and host employees enter the space? If the answer is yes, coordinate entry operations as required by that paragraph, prevent unauthorized entry. And 1910-46 says coordinate entry operation with the contractor when both host employer personnel and contractor personnel will be working in or near permit spaces as required by D11, and develop and implement procedures to coordinate entry operations when employees of more than one employer are working simultaneously as authorized entrants at a permit space. So the employees of one employer do not endanger the employees of any other employer. And that makes a lot of sense. You might have different policies. So if you're both going to be in there, you need to coordinate stuff so you know what's going on. Now, host employees enter to perform entry tasks. Then you say no, then prevent unauthorized entry, and you stop it right there because nobody's going in. Now, does space have known or potential hazards? So the answer is no, not a permit required confined space, and doesn't apply, so stop. So nobody's going there, doesn't have any hazards, so you can stop right here. Can the hazards be eliminated? If you say yes, then the next question is, can the hazards be eliminated? And an employer may choose to reclassify the space to non-permit using 19.146C7, and that is if a permit space poses no actual or potential atmospheric hazards, and if all hazards within the space are eliminated without entry into the space, the permit space may be reclassified as a non-permit confined space for as long as the non-atmosphere hazards remain eliminated. If it is necessary to enter the permit space to eliminate hazards, such entry shall be performed under paragraph D through K of this section. If testing and inspection during that entry demonstrate that the hazards within the permit space have been eliminated, the permit space may be reclassified as a non-permit confined space for as long as the hazards remain eliminated. Note, control of atmospheric hazards through forced air ventilation does not constitute elimination of the hazards. Paragraph C5 covers permit space entry where the employer can demonstrate that forced air ventilation alone will control all hazards in the space. The employer shall document the basis for determining that all hazards in a permit space have been eliminated through a certification that contains the date, the location of the space, and the signature of the person making the determination. The certification shall be made available to each employee entering the space or to that employee's authorized representative. If hazards arise within a permit space that has been declassified to a non-permit space under paragraph C7 of this section, each employee in the space shall exit the space. The employer shall then reevaluate the space and determine whether it must be reclassified as a permit space in accordance with other applicable provisions of this section. Now, can the space be maintained in a condition safe to enter by continuous forced air ventilation only? And you can stop there, and space may be entered under 1910 146C5. And it says an employer may use the alternate procedures of this section for entering a permit space on the conditions set forth in paragraph C5I of this section. And it says that, get out of there, an employer whose employees enter a permit space need not comply with paragraphs D through F and H through K of this section, provided that the employer could demonstrate that the only hazard posed by the permit space is an actual or potential hazardous atmosphere. And then B, the employer can demonstrate that continuous forced air ventilation alone is sufficient to maintain that permit space safe for entry. The employer develops monitoring and inspection data that supports the demonstrations required by paragraphs C5IA and B of the section. And D, if an initial entry of the permit space is necessary to obtain the data required by C5IC of this section, the entry is performed in compliance with paragraphs D through K of the section. So a lot of stuff going on in this thing. And now it says, determinations and supporting data required by these paragraphs are documented by the employer and are made available to each employee who entered the permit space under the terms of paragraph C5 of this section or to that employee's authorized representative. And entry into the permit space under the terms of paragraph C5I of this section is performed in accordance with the requirements of paragraph C5II. Note, see paragraph C7 of this section for classification of permit space after all hazards within the space have been eliminated. So this thing jumps around a lot, and that's really confusing. So now you're going to be prepared for entry via permit procedures. Verify acceptable entry conditions. So we're going to say, okay, somebody has to make a determination here. What are the conditions for entry? What are the acceptable entry conditions? You have to know what the hazards you anticipate, test results recorded, space isolated if needed, rescuers means the summon are available, entrance properly equipped, etc. So you have to know all this stuff. So you have to satisfy all the entry conditions. Now, if you don't, permit's not valid until conditions meet permit specifications. So your permit now becomes the ruling document that you have to comply with that permit. And if it does, permit issued by authorizing signature, acceptable entry conditions maintained throughout entry. And if no, in other words, emergency exists, there's a prohibited condition, entrance evacuated, entry aborts. Call rescuers if needed, permit is void, reevaluate program to correct, prevent prohibited condition. Occurrence of emergency usually is proof of a deficient program. No reentry until program and permit is amended. May require a new program. You might have to start completely over with your program. So emergency means any occurrence, including any failure of hazard control or monitoring equipment or event internal or external to the permit space that could endanger entrance. So you got a monitoring meter there, and for some reason it goes on the fritz. What do? You abort. I think it's over. You can't take any chances in a permit required confined space. So entry task completed, permit returned and canceled. On the permit's done, you completed what had to be done in this confined space. So the permit is basically canceled. And it has to be saved. Audit permit program and permit based on evaluation of entry by entrance, attendee, attendants, testers, and preparers, etc. Anytime you do a confined space entry, there's so many people involved and so many things going on that could go wrong. That when you're done, you should get together and have a debriefing and hash it out and see what happened. And of course, if it something went wrong, you'd be doing this midway through this, and that's really important. You got like it says, you have to find out what went wrong, and then find out, maybe rewrite your whole program if you have to, because it's very important in this confined space thing. And I know this is confusing, so maybe you can go over this flow chart on your own if you want to. It's in your book, it's in your initial book, and it's a pretty good flow chart. So you should take a few minutes to take your time and look at it. And again, this is confusing. So if you think you don't have anything to know about confined space, well, you don't, and I don't either. So I'd have to look it up. That's why I have the manual. So, all right, we're going to do more about confined space in a little bit. Be safe. About a little bit, but maybe tomorrow.